This is the first video I'm making for the Foundation Drilling YouTube channel. This is going to be for both educational purposes and to help us market this business for whenever we decide we want to sell it. So on this channel, I'm probably going to make a bunch of videos explaining what it is that we do, why we do things like we do, what would make somebody want to be in this business, and the different factors that would influence what kind of foundation that you might put in. So let me start by talking a little bit about this particular job. This is a pretty typical foundation option for a tower. This tower had two options. It had a spread footing option and it had a caisson option. So in this case, you had a 38-foot square, 5'9" deep, 1'9" thick mat with some 4-foot piers sticking out of it. So basically, a big square with 3 piers sticking out. That was one possible foundation, and the other one was a 5-foot diameter, 38-foot deep piers. 3 of those. Okay. Now, one thing that's worth thinking about is that when you're doing a spread footing, this is not for that particular job, but this is spread footing, right? And the main advantage of a spread footing is that it doesn't require any really special tools to install it. You don't really have to own much of anything. You can rent just about anything that you need, whether it's an excavator, the skid loaders, even the small tools that you need. You can rent just about everything. So you don't have to have a large investment of equipment to do this kind of job. The disadvantage of this is kind of the same thing. It's that anybody that has a little bit of money and ability to rent equipment and has the energy and the resources in terms of people and knowledge about how to do it can do something like this. When you're talking about caissons, drill shafts, there are a lot more special tools that you need to be able to install something like this. This one is, I don't know, maybe a 5-foot diameter, maybe not, maybe it's 4 foot, something like that. But to drill a hole like the one for the design I had pulled up, a 5-foot by 38-foot, that's going to take quite a machine to do that. It's not something you can go to just any normal rental place and rent. And if you did want to rent something that could do a job like this, it's usually going to be by the month, and it might be $20,000 a month to get something modern that has that kind of capacity. So let me just talk briefly about the economics of this. All right, if you had the example that I showed just a minute ago with the caisson, it would take about 98 yards of concrete, and of course it's going to depend where you are, but using this number, $188 a yard, the concrete would be about $18,400 for the concrete on that one. The spread footing was slightly more concrete, so you'd have $4,500 more in concrete. But the big difference usually between the spread footings and the caissons is the rebar. And in this case, you had, for 3 caissons, it would weigh about 8,200 pounds for the rebar, and for the spread footing would weigh almost 30,000 pounds for the rebar. So just the difference in the rebar at current prices that we pay approximately $1.17 a pound, but by the time you pay for the actual rebar and pay somebody to tie it. And so you're talking about $9,600 for the caisson versus $35,000 for the spread footing. And so we're talking about just the raw material cost on this particular example was almost $30,000 different just for the spread footing. So now it's not always that dramatic. Sometimes it's more dramatic than that, the difference. But the Um, the reason that it can be so different is in this style foundation, basically, uh, the, this would be for a self-support tower, is what they call it. This is like the lattice style three-leg tower. And um, the spread footing is basically a gravity foundation. So it obtains most of its capacity to hold the tower up just from its own weight and the weight of the dirt that's sitting on top of the concrete. Whereas with the caisson, it develops most of its strength and capacity from the friction on the side of the caisson where it connects to the dirt. So I've seen numbers from, I want to say 300 to over 1,000 pounds per square foot of surface area for a caisson, and you have a very small amount of of resistance because of the surface area on the side of the spread footing. These are almost entirely just the weight of it holding it down, whereas this is the weight of the concrete and steel plus the friction on the side. And if you ever try to pull just even a piece of rebar that's been driven in the ground out, then you can appreciate um, the significant role that friction plays when you're trying to extract something from the ground. And similarly, if you're talking about a monopole, which is the style where you'd have a single pole that's like a tapered piece of pipe that would bolt to the middle of the foundation, it works the same way in terms of the spread footings, because whereas in a self-support, the load on each pier is mostly vertical, either up or down, depending on which way the wind's blowing. In a monopole, you have an overturn moment where it's like exerting a torque on the foundation. Um, but the effect on a spread footing is basically the same. That when it's trying to tip over one way or the other, it's lifting one side of the pier or one side of the mat and pushing down on the other. And on a caisson, it's different between them, because if you have three piers and they're spread 20 or 30 feet apart, then you have mostly vertical loads on the piers if it's a self-support. Whereas if you have a monopole, then you have an overturn moment, and but the actual loads that goes into the ground is pretty different. So when you have um, the self-support tower, the caisson is trying to be either pulled straight out or put straight down, pretty much. And with the monopole, it's trying to tip it over in the ground. And in both cases, you're basically mobilizing the weight and the resistance of the dirt around the caisson. That's where the caisson gets its strength from primarily. Whereas with the spread footing, it's with the weight. And so to make the mat stiff enough to where it can resist breaking apart, it requires a lot of rebar to do that. And so consequently, the material to install that type of foundation is usually a good bit more than a caisson with a similar capacity. It's not always the case. I don't understand all the reasons why engineers do what they do. Sometimes I think they do things that are pretty silly. They'll have a foundation that would be a caisson that has a ridiculous amount of rebar in it and a large diameter, um, such that maybe the material would cost more for the caissons than it would for spread footing. I don't think it ever makes sense for that to be the case, but occasionally it is. But the more typical example is something like this, where you have a more modest cost for your material on the caisson compared to your spread footing. So this is one big reason why that you might consider getting in the drilling business versus just doing spread footings. For one thing, you'll be competing with a lot smaller number of people doing a more specialized thing, and there's usually a lot better money on each job for the caisson jobs, and in terms of the profit that's left over, that's typically the case. So I think that's all I'm going to say in this video is that there's, because of the inherent nature of the caisson, that it typically requires less material. That is the main reason why that it would make sense to install a caisson as compared to a spread footing. I mean, there are other reasons like weather considerations. You're going to have a spread footing open for more days in a row than you would a typical caisson, and it's harder to protect a large excavation from water intrusion than it is a caisson. So if you're dealing with a rainy place, then a spread footing is going to potentially be more vulnerable to that than a caisson would. And the other thing is going to be the ground conditions. So if you have a high water table or shallow rock, then very often it's going to be the case that, especially if you had both of those conditions, if you had shallow rock and a high water table, then it's almost certainly going to be better to do a spread footing because the complications of dealing with groundwater and especially with rock and especially with both at the same time is going to be extraordinary, and it would normally be better to just do a spread footing. So if the rock is deep and the water is deep, then often it's going to be better to do a caisson. If it's shallow to those things, then often it's going to be better to do a spread footing. And so those kind of dynamics are what's going to affect the choice often as far as what price you're going to give for each type foundation. So hopefully that makes sense, and I will be following up with some other videos about other things to consider.